All right, kiddos, take a second, get a laugh in. I had a little mishap with my hair. It's over, whatever. So we talked about natural selection before all of this chaos erupted. We talked about just the basis of natural selection and how that works. And then now we're going to go into 7.4, which is population genetics. And then I'm going to make a separate video for the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, just so that it's not too long and you're not super bogged down by all of the information. So a population is a group of individuals of the same species which live in the same area, and they interbreed and can produce fertile offspring. So not like ligers, right? Because they're not the because there are two different species, and their offspring are sterile. So same species, same area that can produce fertile offspring. And then a gene pool is within that population all of the different alleles that are possible and that are present in that specific area within those species. So it consists of all the copies of every type of allele. And if there's only one allele present for a particular locus in the population, then that means it's fixed. And then there's many fixed alleles, which means that there's less genetic diversity. Okay. So, by the way, if you want to write any of this down, just feel free to pause it, and then you can just write the notes at your own pace. That is up to you. So populations' allele frequencies will change over time, and we're going to talk about how that happens. And remember that populations evolve, not individuals. You can't just wake up one day and decide that you want to have a tail. It happens over generations, and it happens over a long period of time. So microevolution, which is a type of evolution at just a small scale, and this is actually more common because it's harder to evolve a larger population, right? So this is small-scale genetic changes in a population, and evolution is driven by random occurrences. Okay. So whether it be mutations, whether it be genetic drift, which we'll talk about what that means, whether it be migration or gene flow or natural selection, which we've talked about already in class. Okay. So as a review, we've talked about mutations in class before, but mutations can result in genetic variation. It's actually the top reason we have genetic variation is through mutations and crossing over during meiosis, like we've talked about in class. And it can form new alleles. And natural selection can act on varied phenotypes, and mutation rates tend to be slow in plants and animals because we have very long, drawn-out generation times, whereas in prokaryotes, mutations are very common because of the generation time is so much faster than in plants and animals. So just as a note, usually there's a negative connotation when we talk about mutations, but in reality, without mutations, evolution wouldn't happen, period. So mutations can be harmful, neutral, or beneficial. Usually they're in the harmful to neutral categories, but when they are beneficial, that's how natural selection and evolution happen. So most of them are in the neutral or harmful range, and not all mutations will lead to evolution because they're not beneficial. But when they are beneficial, that is how natural selection occurs. Okay. So genetic drift is one of our ways for genetic diversity. This is like chance events that cause a change in allele frequency from one generation to the next. And this could be a number of different things, and we'll talk about a few different examples. This is most significant in small populations because things that are chance will have more of an impact. So let's say like a fire or something will have much more of an impact on a small population than it would a large population. So this can lead to a loss of genetic variation, and it usually does, and you can see why in a second. And it can also cause harmful alleles to become fixed, which is a good thing. And it does not produce adaptations. So there's two types of genetic drift. There's the bottleneck effect and the founder effect, and we'll go into both of those in detail. Okay, so the bottleneck effect, as you can see by this visual, just means that there is an original population, right, with this is the gene flow, so all of the available alleles in that population. And because of a bottlenecking event, the surviving population has much less of a gene pool, a much smaller gene pool than the initial population. So the bottleneck effect is when a large population is drastically reduced by a non-selective disaster, right? So this could be floods, famine, fires, hurricanes, over like fishing, hunting, that kind of thing. And some alleles might be become overrepresented, underrepresented, or absent. So it kind of skews the gene pool over to whatever, by chance, there's an allele that will survive over others. Okay, and then we have the founder effect, which is when a few individuals will become isolated from a large population, and then they'll establish a new population that's smaller with a gene pool that differs from the initial larger population. With this visual, there's a parent population, this very large population, and some of them migrate to like an isolated area where they're no longer a part of the parent population. So then you see that there's lots of this, like the majority of this small population now is red, right? But for some reason, by chance, the purple ones may reproduce, and then they become over time the majority allele for that population. So this is literally just by chance that the purple would mate and make more purple, and then those purples would mate and make a population that has completely purple alleles with none of the red alleles from the parent population. Okay. And this is a loss of genetic diversity, which can be detrimental, but it kind of depends. Okay, so the next thing that we'll talk about is gene flow. This is the transfer of alleles into or out of a population due to the fertile individuals or gametes. So the alleles will be transferred between populations. For example, this population of bluebirds there might be a bluebird that immigrates over here that has the heterozygous genotype, and it mates with these, let me get this out of the way. It mates with these red birds, and then the selection pressure against the dominant phenotype will create the homozygous population over here. So for whatever reason, on this side of the mountain, the recessive gene, so the red gene, is more beneficial, and so they will, through natural selection, select for this recessive gene. And then over here, for whatever reason, on this side of the mountain, the blue phenotype is more beneficial, so they will select for the dominant genotype. Okay, my phone or my computer is dying, so give me one sec. All right, so an example would be that the pollen being blown to a new location will transfer the alleles from that population to the population maybe across the pond. I don't know, but then it'll increase the diversity over there. Okay, so I'm going to have you examine a few scenarios, and then you're going to determine whether it is the bottleneck effect, founder effect, or genetic drift. Okay, so I'll read them out for you. Maybe pause the video, think about it for a second, and then we'll get to the answer and why that is the answer. Okay, so the first scenario is that there is a black robin, and it's a small bird native to the Chatham Islands in New Zealand. And before the 19th century, much of their habitat was converted to farmland. And due to the loss of their habitat and the introduction of non-native predators like cats, the population declined to its lowest point. So now the population is very small. It's only 5 individuals. And since then, the conservation efforts have brought the population number back to an estimated 230 individuals. Okay. So this is a bottleneck effect due to human activity. So that would have decreased the population to 5 individuals, and that means that the 5 individuals that had whatever alleles that they had are going to be the ones that pass on their genes, because the rest of them, whether or not there was a lot of genetic diversity to begin with, they died off and they are no longer going to be part of that gene pool. So yeah, it's bottleneck effect. The next scenario. So in the 1720s, an Amish population settled into Pennsylvania, and then a small number of the early settlers were from Germany and carried an unusual number of mutations, one of which included polydactyly, poly meaning many, and then dactyly is like the arrangement of your fingers. So it just means, if you can look at this picture right here, it just means people with more than 5 fingers on each of their hands. So the trait for polydactyly is now much more common in the Amish population than it is in the general population. So think about it. I'll give you a couple seconds to figure out which of the examples this is. Okay, so yeah, this is the founder effect. Because this small number of heavily polydactyly, however you want to say it, people migrated and then they reproduced, and now the trait for polydactyly is much more common than it was beforehand. Okay. And then lastly, a recurrent flash floods have caused mass mortalities in the marble trout population. So scientists have analyzed the genetic makeup of the remaining marble trout population and have found that the genetic diversity has decreased significantly. So the one that we talked about that is by chance and usually is from a disaster is which one? Yeah, the bottleneck effect. I forgot there's another one, sorry, not lastly. So due to an increase, the next one says, due to an increase in wind in a local area, pollen from one population of flowers has traveled further than usual and pollinated another population of flowers. And this should be easy because I gave you that example earlier. But the offspring of these flowers now have traits of each population. So which one is this? Gene flow, yeah. Okay, so we've talked about natural selection, and now that we're a little bit more familiar with it, I just want to look closer at how it can affect a population. So reproductive success is measured by relative fitness. We know this from the first lecture that we did on natural selection. And the number of surviving offspring that an individual produces compared to the number left by others in the population. That is the relative fitness that we have used to assess fitness. So the number of surviving offspring that an individual produces, and that's compared to the number left by others in the population. Okay, so the effects of natural selection can be measured by examining the changes in the mean of phenotypes. And there are three modes of natural selection. There's directional selection, stabilizing selection, and disruptive selection. And we'll talk about all three of those, and I'll give you visual for that. Okay, so directional selection, if you look at this, the red is before selection, or this is a bell curve, right? This is just a normal curve if we're talking about statistically. Okay, so before selection, we have this red perfect bell curve in each of these. And then in directional selection, as you can see, it's kind of like skewed to the right in this case, right? So this is selection towards one extreme phenotype. For whatever reason, an extreme phenotype has been more beneficial for that population in order to reproduce and survive. So the selection is towards an extreme. The next one is stabilizing selection, and before I give you the definition, this is, as you can see, if you know anything about statistics, this normal curve right here would be the mean, right? So it's avoiding both extremes for whatever the phenotype is. So for stabilizing selection, there's a selection towards the mean and against the extreme phenotypes. So whatever the middle ground is for that phenotype, that is what the population is selecting for. Okay, and then as you can probably guess by this disruptive selection, if you look at these, this curve is avoiding the mean. So for whatever reason, the more extreme phenotypes on both ends are more beneficial for that population's survival and reproduction. So there's a selection against the mean. So both phenotype extremes have the highest relative fitness for that specific genotype that we're talking about. Okay. All right. So sexual selection is, I don't remember if we talked about this in class yet. I think I mentioned it, but sexual selection is a type of natural selection that explains why many species have unique or showy traits. So these are not traits that help the animal survive better, per se. It's just specifically phenotypes that are the most impressive to the females in that population. So males will often have useless structures. So a colorful male peacock, I think we did talk about this in class. The peacock feathers, if it's really, really large, if the feathers are really large, they can actually be a hindrance to the peacock because it can avoid predators, for example. So these are useless structures, but because females like them and choose them for reproduction, the large peacock feathers win over time, and we're selecting for a phenotype that is strictly just for sexual reproduction. So it can reproduce traits that are harmful to survival. Like I said, with the peacocks, they can be too big, and it can make it to where the peacock has trouble moving. Another example is with crabs with their like really, really big claws. Those can be a hindrance to their movement as well, but the ladies like them, so they will continue to select for them because that's what gets the females to mate with them. So an example would be that the colorful feathers, in male peacocks make them easier to spot by predators. They're also heavy, like I said. that is natural selection. All right, so we will talk about Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. I'll make that lecture maybe tomorrow. We'll see how this whole coronavirus thing sorts itself out. But for now, you have a worksheet on Google Classroom that I want you to look at. And if you can, print it out and then do that worksheet. If you can't, just do it on a piece of paper. But it has all of that population genetics problems like we just did on the lecture. Okay, so I love you guys. Stay safe. I will see you as soon as I can see you.